16mm film is a popular, economical gauge of film. 16mm is the width of the film. Other common film gauges include 8mm and 35mm. It is generally used for non-theatrical filmmaking or for low-budget motion pictures. It also existed as a popular amateur or home movie-making format for several decades, alongside 8mm film and, later, Super 8mm film. In 1923, Eastman Kodak released the first 16mm outfit consisting of a camera, projector, tripod, screen and splicer for $335. RCA-Victor introduced a 16mm sound movie projector in 1932 and developed an optical sound-on-film 16mm camera, released in 1935. History: Eastman Kodak introduced 16mm film in 1923 as a less expensive amateur alternative to 35mm film. During the 1920s, the format was often referred to as substandard by the professional industry. Kodak hired Willard Beach Cook from his 28mm Pathscope of America company to create the new 16mm Kodascope library. In addition to making home movies, people could buy or rent films from the library, a key selling aspect of the format. Intended for amateur use, 16mm film was one of the first formats to use acetate safety film as a film base. Kodak never used nitrate film for the format because of the high flammability of the nitrate base. 35mm nitrate was discontinued in 1952. Production evolution The silent 16mm format was initially aimed at the home enthusiast, but by the 1930s it had begun to make inroads into the educational market. The addition of optical soundtracks and, most notably, Kodachrome in 1935, gave an enormous boost to the 16mm market. Used extensively in WW2, there was a huge expansion of 16mm professional filmmaking in the post-war years. Films for government, business, medical and industrial clients created a large network of 16mm professional filmmakers and related service industries in the 1950s and 1960s. The advent of television production also enhanced the use of 16mm film, initially for its advantage of cost and portability over 35mm. At first used as a news-gathering format, the 16mm format was also used to create television programming shot outside the confines of the more rigid television studio production sets. The home movie market gradually switched to the even less expensive 8mm film and Super 8mm format. 16mm has been extensively used for television production with light cameras in many countries before portable video cameras appeared. Replacing analog video devices, digital video has made significant inroads in television production use. Nevertheless, 16mm is still in use in its Super 16 ratio for low-cost productions. Format standards. Standard 16mm The picture-taking area of standard 16mm is 10.26mm by 7.49mm, an aspect ratio of 1.37 to 1, the standard pre-widescreen Academy ratio for 35mm. The nominal picture projection area is 0.380 in by 0.284 in, and the maximum picture projection area is 0.384 in by 0.286 in, each implying an aspect ratio of 1.34 to 1. Double perf 16mm film, the original format, has a perforation at both sides of every frame line. Single perf is perforated at one side only, making room for an optical or magnetic soundtrack along the other side. Super 16mm The variant called Super 16mm, Super 16, or 16mm Type W, developed by Swedish cinematographer Rune Eriksson in 1969, uses single sprocket film, and takes advantage of the extra room for an expanded picture area of 7.41mm by 12.52mm with a wider aspect ratio of 1.67. Super 16 cameras are usually 16mm cameras that have had the film gate and ground glass in the viewfinder modified for the wider frame. Since Super 16 takes up the space originally reserved for the soundtrack, films shot in this format can be enlarged by optical printing to 35 mm for projection. However, with the recent development of digital intermediate workflows, it is now possible to digitally enlarge to 35 mm with virtually no quality loss, or alternatively to use high-quality video equipment for the original image capture. In 2009, German lens manufacturer Vantage introduced a series of anamorphic lenses under its Hawk brand. These provided a 1.3x squeeze factor specifically for the Super 16 format. These lenses let camera operators use the entire Super 16 frame for 2.351 widescreen photography. Ultra 16 mm The DIY crafted Ultra 16 is a variation of Super 16. Cinematographer Frank G. DeMarco is credited with inventing Ultra 16 in 1996 while shooting tests for Darren Aronofsky's Pi. Ultra 16 is created by widening the left and right sides of the gate of a standard 16 mm camera by 0.7 mm to expose part of the vertical area between the perforations. Perforation placement on standard 16 mm film accommodates use of this normally unexposed area. The Ultra 16 format, with frame dimensions of 11.66 mm by 6.15 mm, provides a frame size between standard 16 mm and Super 16 while avoiding the expense of converting a 16 mm camera to Super 16, the lens requirements of Super 16 cameras, and image vignetting caused by traditional 16 mm cameras. Thus, standard 16 mm optics achieve a wider image. The image readily converts to NTSC PAL, HDTV into 35 mm film, using either both the full vertical frame or the full width frame, depending upon application. Modern usage. The two major suppliers of 16 mm film today are Kodak and AIG for 16 mm film is used in television, such as for the Hallmark Hall of Fame anthology and Friday Night Lights and the OC, as well as for The Walking Dead in the US. In the UK, the format is exceedingly popular for dramas and commercials. The British Broadcasting Corporation played a large part in the development of the format. They worked extensively with Kodak during the 1950s and 1960s to bring 16 mm to a professional level, since the BBC needed cheaper, more portable production solutions while maintaining a higher quality than was offered at the time, when the format was mostly for home display of theatrical shorts, newsreels, and cartoons, documentary capture and display for various purposes, and limited high-end amateur use. Today the format also is frequently used for student films, while usage in documentary has almost disappeared. With the advent of HDTV, Super 16 film is still used for some productions destined for HD. Some low-budget theatrical features are shot on 16 mm and Super 16 mm such as Kevin Smith's 16 mm 1994 Independent It Clerks. Thanks to advances in film stock and digital technology specifically digital intermediate the format has dramatically improved in picture quality since the 1970s, and is now a revitalized option. Vera Drake, for example, was shot on Super 16 mm film, digitally scanned at a high resolution, edited and color-graded, and then printed out onto 35 mm film via a laser film recorder. Because of the digital process, the final 35 mm print quality is good enough to fool some professionals into thinking it was shot on 35 mm. In Britain most exterior television footage was shot on 16 mm from the 1960s until the 1990s, when the development of more portable television cameras and videotape machines led to video replacing 16 mm in many instances. Many drama shows and documentaries were made entirely on 16 mm, notably Brideshead Revisited, The Jewel in the Crown, The Ascent of Man and Life on Earth. More recently, the advent of widescreen television has led to the use of Super 16. For example, the 2008/09 BBC fantasy drama series Merlin was shot in Super 16. The BBC considers Super 16 a standard definition film format, but other broadcasting and production companies may have different outlook. In particular, Scrubs has been shot on Super 16 from the start and is aired either as 4:3 SD or as 16:9 HD. John Inwood, the cinematographer of the series, believed that footage from his Ayrton XTR Prod camera was not only sufficient to air in high definition, it looked terrific. However, the BBC has recently announced that it would no longer accept 16mm as an origination format for high-definition video transfer. The Academy Award-winning Leaving Las Vegas was shot on 16mm. For more movies filmed in Super 16mm, see films shot in Super 16. The first 2 seasons of Buffy the Vampire Slayer were shot on 16mm and were switched to 35mm for its later seasons. The first season of the popular series Sex and the City was shot on 16mm. Later seasons were shot on 35mm. All 3 seasons of Veronica Mars were shot on 16mm and aired in HD. This is Spinal Tap, and Christopher Guest's subsequent mockumentary films, are shot in Super 16mm. The first 3 seasons of Stargate SG-1 were shot in 16mm, before switching to 35mm for later seasons. The 2009 Academy Award winner for Best Picture, The Hurt Locker, was shot using Ayrton Super 16mm cameras and Fujifilm 16mm film stocks. The cost savings over 35mm allowed the production to utilize multiple cameras for many shots, exposing over 1 million feet of film. British Napoleonic-era drama Sharp was shot on Super 16mm right through to the film Sharp's Challenge. For the last film in the series, Sharp's Peril, the producers switched to 35mm. Moonrise Kingdom was shot using Super 16mm. Digital 16mm A number of digital cameras approximate the look of the 16mm format by using 16mm sized sensors and taking 16mm lenses. These cameras include the Iconscope A-Cam DII and the Digital Bolex. The Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera has a Super 16 sized sensor. Cameras Professional cameras Today, the professional industry tends to use 16mm cameras from Ayrton and Arri, most notably the Ayrton XTR, Ayrton XTR PROD, Arriflex 16s to Radians 3, and Arriflex 416. Ayrton also released the A-Minima, which is about the size of a video camcorder and is used for specialized filming requiring smaller, more versatile cameras. Photosonics have special extremely high-speed cameras for 16mm that film at up to 1000 frames per second. Panavision has produced the Panaflex 16, nicknamed Elaine. Amateur cameras For amateur, hobbyist, and student use, it is more economical to use older models from Arri, Ayrton, Auricon, Bewley, Bell & Howell, Bolex, Canon, Cinema Products, Eclair, Keystone, Krasnogorsk, Mitchell, and others. Film reproduction methods. Most original movie production companies that use film shoot on 35mm. The 35mm size must be converted or reduced to 16mm for 16mm systems. There are multiple ways of obtaining a 16mm print from 35mm. The preferred method is to strike a 16mm negative from the original 35mm negative and then make a print from the new 16mm negative. A 16mm negative struck from the original 35mm negative is called an original. A new 16mm print made from a print with no negative is called a reversal. 16mm prints can be made from many combinations of size and format, each with a distinct, descriptive name. A 16mm negative struck from an original 35mm print is a print down. A 16mm negative struck from an original 16mm print that was struck from a 35mm original is a dupe down. A 16mm print struck directly from a 16mm print is a double dupe. A 16mm print struck directly from a 35mm print is a double dupe down. Film traders often refer to 16mm prints by the prints production method, that is, an original, reversal, dupe down, double dupe, or double dupe down. Color fading of old film and color recovery. Over time, The cyan, magenta and yellow dyes that form the image in color 16mm film inevitably fade. The rate of deterioration depends on storage conditions and the film type. In the case of Kodachrome amateur and documentary films and Technicolor IB color prints, the dyes are so stable and the deterioration so slow that even prints now over 70 years old typically show no obvious problems. Unfortunately, dyes in the far more common Eastman Kodak print film and similar products from other manufacturers are notoriously unstable. Prior to the introduction of a longer-lasting low-fade type in 1979, Eastman Kodak prints routinely suffered from easily seen color shift and fading within 10 years. The dyes degrade at different rates, with magenta being the longest-lasting, eventually resulting in a pale reddish image with little if any other color discernible. In the process of digitizing old color films, even badly faded source material can sometimes be restored to full color through digital techniques that amplify the faded dye colors. Technical specifications: 7.62 mm per frame for print stock, 7.605 mm per frame for camera stock, 122 meters equals about 11 minutes at 24 frame s, vertical pull-down, 16 mm, 1.37 aspect ratio, enlarging ratio of 1, 4.58 for 35 mm Academy format prints, camera aperture, 10.26 by 7.49 mm, projector aperture, 9.65 by 7.21 mm, projector aperture, 9.60 by 5.20 mm, TV station aperture, 9.65 by 7.26 mm, TV transmission, 9.34 by 7.01 mm, TV safe action, 8.40 by 6.29 mm. Corner radii, 1.67 mm, TV safe titles, 7.44 by 5.61 mm. Corner radii, 1.47 mm, 1 perforation per frame, picture to sound separation, sound in advance of picture by 26 frames for optical sound and 28 frames for magnetic. Super 16, 1.66 aspect ratio, camera aperture, 12.52 by 7.41 mm, projector aperture, 11.76 by 7.08 mm, projector aperture, 11.76 by 6.37 mm, 1 perforation per frame, always single perf, ultra 16, 1.85 aspect ratio, camera aperture, 11.66 mm by 7.49 mm, projector aperture, 11.66 mm by 6.15 mm, 1 perforation per frame. See also, techniques, list of film formats, sync sound, pelotron, related film genres, direct cinema, Cine copyright Marvar copyright Rita copyright, docufiction, ethnographic film, ethnofiction. References. External links, History of sub-35mm film formats and cameras, Super 16 modification of Bolex Reflex 16mm camera, Suite 16, A-list cinematographers say the emulsioner unregistered trademark S never looked so good, here unregistered trademark SY. Written February 1, 2005, and accessed December 29, 2005. DIY processing 16mm a Euro guide for DIY processing of black-white 16mm film.